Hello everybody and welcome to my little Assassin's Creed 3 post-game discussion video. And when I say little, I mean probably not so little at all, but I will also try not to make it too long. And there are basically three different aspects that I want to talk about. The first is, as usual, the gameplay. Then I want to talk about the new setting and Connor's story in particular. And finally, about the ending of the game and Desmond's story, because I'm going to assume the ending is also the end to Desmond's story. So let's start with the gameplay. This is going to be fairly short because, it's Assassin's Creed. I have talked about the gameplay a lot of times, and they didn't really change that much, although I would say they changed more in this game than they did in the previous games of the Ezio trilogy. Sure, they always added a little bit to it, but I think they added more major changes in this game than previously, and I will talk a little bit about that later. But maybe before that, I have picked 2 points of criticism that I want to mention. One of them is something that I've mentioned on more than one occasion during the game, and that's the fact that the game doesn't always explain very well how to play the game. I had to go to Google and look up stuff on more than one occasion in this game, and I was a lot more confused during this game than in any other Assassin's Creed game before. And that can't be a good sign. So it's usually just minor details, but they didn't get explained or not very well, or you just got a little pop-up text at the bottom of the screen that vanished after 20 seconds before you were able to read it. Just a few examples, like when your assassins fall in battle, that happened actually while I was recording, and I had no idea what that means, so I looked it up on Google. It means they are injured and you can't use them for a few minutes. But I seem to remember that in one of the previous games, I think it was Brotherhood, your assassins could actually die and then you had to recruit a new one. So a little explanation would have been nice in the situation. Or something that happened while I was doing off-camera stuff. We did get a fairly decent tutorial about sending convoys to earn money. So at some point I was like, yeah, sure, let's send a convoy while I collect some trinkets in the homestead. And a few minutes later I got a message, defend your convoy, and a timer of 4 minutes. And I had no idea what to do because, again, no explanation whatsoever. And since I was on a timer, I just tapped out of the game. I googled it to see what I had to do. And apparently I had to go to the frontier, find the convoy on the map, and literally defend it. Or, the naval missions. I didn't know how to access the naval missions for like half of the game until I noticed that if you talk to a harbor master, you can get that naval map. And yes, all of them are just minor details, and if you click around a bit and look through all the menus, you can figure it out on your own. But I feel you shouldn't have to. The game should explain this stuff to you, and you shouldn't have to go to Google to look it up. So I don't know what it is about this game, but I feel they didn't do a very good job explaining certain things. And these examples aren't even the only ones. There were more examples throughout the game where things were seriously underexplained. Let's put it like that. And the other point of criticism that I have, that the game has a few weird design choices that make the game more cumbersome than it has to be. For example, weird lack of fast travel points in the frontier. I understand, it's the frontier. You are supposed to explore it. And I think that's completely fair. But once you have explored a map, I think in the interest of convenient gameplay, there should be a decent amount of fast travel stations, so you don't have to run to the same place again and again and again. And there were like 4 fast travel stations in the entire frontier, and some regions were not accessible by fast travel at all. So that's just a weird decision, in my opinion. Especially since in the cities you actually had a lot of fast travel stations, even though the cities were a lot smaller. But then you had to unlock these fast travel points in what is probably the most mind-bogglingly boring mission I've ever seen in any Assassin's Creed games. Walking through dark tunnels and finding the way in a maze to get to the fast travel spots. I noped out of those missions after, the first attempt, and I never went back because I felt that the time spent unlocking all these stations would be longer than just, going on foot, because the cities weren't that big to begin with. So I never finished any of these missions because that was just a stupid concept. And there are other examples where I felt the game wasn't all that well designed. For example, when I finally went around to craft some weapons, I went to the manor to, use the crafting table and craft a new sword and stuff. And then I noticed that when you craft weapons, it doesn't show you the stats of the weapon. And I didn't want to craft all the weapons, just the most powerful ones, but I had no way of seeing the stats when crafting. So I had to fast travel back to a shop, because only in the shop you can see the stats of the weapons. Of course, you can't actually buy them there, because you cannot buy these weapons, you have to craft them. So why are they in the shop to begin with? I don't know. But you can only see the stats in the shop. And then when you're in the shop, you can switch back to the crafting menu. But not in the manor. In the manor, you only have the crafting menu, but not the shop. And no way to see the stats of the weapon. And yeah, it's just a small detail. But it's design decisions like that just made some aspects of the game a bit more cumbersome than they really had to be. So these would basically be my two major points of criticism that I have about the gameplay. Maybe let's talk about the positive aspects as well. First of all, I thought the game looked pretty nice, especially the animations. Connor's battle moves seem to be a lot more sophisticated and diverse than they had been in previous games. He had some pretty badass moves in battle, I have to say that. And even outside of battle, he had some pretty good animations. For example, I'm pretty sure he had like 3 different ways to jump over a small fence. And it just felt all very smooth. And I really liked just running around and, looking at Connor run through the forest or climb over stuff. I mean, it wasn't bad by any means in previous games, but I think they even managed to improve this in this game. So while this is not a major aspect of the game, it's definitely something that stood out to me. And then we have a number of new additions, most of which I thought were actually pretty well done. We obviously have the parkouring and free running through nature, which is a new aspect. And I mean, they kind of had to include that because there was just more nature in this game than cities. And even the cities were not quite as well suited for parkouring than the cities of the previous games, because the cities we have been to before, Rome, Jerusalem, Constantinople, are all ancient cities that are very densely populated, and now you obviously had a much more modern layout and broad streets that would stop your parkouring every now and then. So they added the free running in nature, which took me a while to get used to. I had some real problems climbing trees at the beginning, but once I actually, got a hang of it, it was indeed a lot of fun. So I think they did a good job with that. And then obviously we have the naval battles. Again, after the first mission, I was not entirely sure if I was going to like it. But once I got used to it and I got some upgrades for the ship, making it a little bit easier, I actually had a lot of fun doing those naval battles. And seeing how the next game is about pirates, I expect more of that to come in the future, and I'm actually looking forward to that. So yeah, I would say in conclusion, the gameplay is fine. It's Assassin's Creed. It had some nice additions. It had a few things that didn't feel quite as fluid as they should be, and they surely need to do a better job at explaining stuff. But other than that, the gameplay is fine, just as always. I don't have any major grievances with the way the game plays. And maybe one last thing, not really gameplay related, but it's about the design of the game. I thought the nature setting looked really beautiful. I mean, the previous games have already proven that they can do cities and metropolitan areas really, really well, but everything outside of cities always looked rather underwhelming, to be honest. But in this game, they put a lot of effort in designing the forest, and it was not just like a flat forest with a few trees, but there were hills in the forest and you could go up and down, and there was a day-night cycle and weathers, and it was actually fun running around. So in the end, I even collected all the feathers simply because I enjoyed running through the environment. And that made these collection missions a little bit less boring than, for example, the tunnel missions, because at least it was pretty to look at, while the tunnel missions were just walking through a dark tunnel. So I ended up doing a lot more of the grindy stuff than I expected, which is partially due to the fact that I was sick for 2 weeks, so I couldn't record, and I did a lot of the stuff that I thought I wouldn't do because I was going for a more reduced playthrough originally. Alright, enough about the gameplay. Let's talk about the setting now, because I think the change in setting is definitely bigger than it was in previous games. Even the change from the first to the second game was not really that big. Even though there were a few hundred years in between these two games, they were still essentially medieval Mediterranean cities, and all the games of the Ezio trilogy played in these kind of cities with a different flavor, obviously, and there were obvious differences between the cities, but also large similarities, which is partially because all of them have once been part of the Roman Empire. So there is a certain shared heritage here. But going from these medieval Mediterranean cities to colonial America definitely was the biggest shift in setting they have done so far, which at the same time I thought was interesting and kind of weird. I thought it was interesting not just because you finally got to explore something new, but also because they had to recontextualize the assassins and Templars in this new setting. And Templars and assassins seems like something that is just more native to the Middle Ages, I guess. So they had to figure out how these ancient orders would work in a more modern setting. What would they do? How would they function? What would their affiliations be? So this was at the same time interesting and also kind of unusual, because it just felt weird to see these ancient entities in this more modern setting, and it took me a while to get used to it. Also, I can't help but wonder if setting the story in this relatively recent time period maybe limited their artistic freedom a little bit, because on the one hand, we just know a lot more about this more recent time. But at the same time, it also seems more familiar and maybe more relevant to our modern days than the settings we had before. So they probably, and this is just my theory, they may have felt more compelled to stay closer to the historical truth, whereas in previous games they could take more artistic liberties with certain historical events and just reimagine them to fit their story. But I wouldn't be surprised if they were trying to go for greater historical accuracy in this game. Also, if you think about it, the power struggles we had before, the political conflicts that happened during the previous games, like Renaissance nobles in Italy fighting for power, or palace intrigue in early 16th century Constantinople. I'm going to assume that there are very few people alive today that actually have a horse in those races. So you could look at those political conflicts from a fairly distant perspective. I would wager to guess that this is not the case with the conflict between the Patriots and the British. So I don't know, I wonder if this made them more careful about how they tell their story. I don't know, this is just my impression that I got from this story. But still, overall, I thought it was nice to have a new setting, especially one that I wasn't all that familiar with. So I feel that I actually learned quite a bit from this. And I'm looking forward to see more stories. Well, not set in quite the same time period, I guess, but if the next game is about pirates, then I'm going to assume it is at least close to this time period. We will see. All right, next, let's talk about Connor, our protagonist. And from what I've heard, it seems that Connor is not that well liked among Assassin's Creed fans. Personally, I didn't mind him. However, I would say that he has one big problem, and that's the fact that he came right after Ezio. And Ezio had 3 games to grow as a character. So not only did he have more time to develop different aspects of his personality, but each of the game also focused on a very particular part of his story and, I would say, his character development. In the first Ezio game, I would actually argue that he was not completely unsimilar to Connor. Both of them were basically angry young men looking for revenge. Of course, Ezio covered up a lot of it with charm and humor, and Connor was a lot more open and direct about it. But their basic motivation was basically the same. And I would even say that Ezio didn't really become an assassin in a sense that he was fighting for the assassin's ideals until the second game, or at the very end of the first game maybe, because that's when he basically let go of his revenge. I mean, he didn't even kill Rodrigo Borgia in the end. And the second game was all about him fighting against the Borgia, not so much for personal motives. I mean, there were personal motives because the Borgia were still after him and they destroyed Monteriggioni and they killed Uncle Mario. But it wasn't really put into the focus of his motives. I think the main motivation in Brotherhood was he was fighting them because they were cruel tyrants and he wanted to help people. So I would say that's when he became a real assassin, in a sense that he was not so much motivated by his own personal reasons, but because he wanted to fight for the ideals of the Assassin's Order. And then we had Revelations, where his role was mostly that of a mentor who passed on his knowledge to the next generation. And Connor, they just tried to do all these 3 things with Connor, but just in one game. So he was the angry young man looking for revenge. At the same time, we were supposed to believe that he was actually, an assassin who believed in the ideals of the assassins. He also was a mentor, training other assassins, even though he still was very young. So I feel it was maybe just a little bit too much for one game, and not all of these aspects worked all that well for him. I mean, I definitely do believe the angry young man angle. I think that was the most obvious in this game. Sadly, I also think it was the least interesting one, simply because it's exactly the same that we already had for Ezio. So I don't know why they felt the need to repeat the same motivation again. Honestly, I would have preferred it if they completely cut out the revenge angle and just make Connor someone who wants to be an assassin because he, wants to fight for freedom. I mean, that's a much better motivation, in my opinion, than just pure revenge, especially since the revenge angle just seemed to overshadow the fight for freedom angle a lot. And that is something that Connor and Ezio have in common. They both only started working as assassins because it gave them the chance to exact their revenge. They couldn't have done it otherwise because they were on their own. They didn't have the training. So they started training because they wanted to take revenge. And Ezio had the chance to grow out of that in Brotherhood by actually, becoming an assassin. Connor just didn't get that chance. So his fight for the assassins, I don't know. There were points in the game where I thought it was believable, where I thought, okay, I can see that these are ideals he wants to fight for. But sometimes it just felt like, he's working for them because the Templars just happened to work for the other side. And if the Templars had been more openly supportive of the Patriots, then maybe Connor would have ended up working for the British. I don't know. So I feel the revenge story should not have been here because it's just a repeat of Ezio's story. And I honestly hope that in one of the upcoming games we get an assassin that has a different motivation for joining the assassins other than I want to take revenge, or, as Altair, I was just born into it and I never knew anything else. I would actually really like to see an assassin who says, hey, I want to fight for this order because they fight for something I believe in. That would be a novel idea, right? So let's see what we will get in the next few games. Again, didn't really feel all that convincing because Connor was barely an assassin himself and he was already a mentor to other assassins. I guess I had to include it because you kind of wanted to have the same Brotherhood mechanic again, but it didn't really feel all that believable. However, there's one part of Connor's character that I actually thought was very believable, and that was probably the best part of his story, and that was his whole community building aspect, the homestead, and creating the society that he was actually trying to fight for and that he didn't really achieve in the end of the game. The British were leaving, but for, people like him, it didn't really change. His people moved away, but at the very least, we still had the homestead, and in the homestead, he was able to create that kind of society that he believed in, and he helped all these people to lead a better life. And that I thought was probably the best and most believable aspect of his character. And that's where they kind of found a way to make him different. I mean, sure, we had this kind of aspect in the Ezio games as well. You could rebuild Monteregione. But in that game, it felt more like just a mere business transaction. You paid some money to reopen the brothel and that was it. In this game, you could actually really build a community, and that was a really new and fresh aspect of the game that we didn't have in the same kind of detail in the previous games. So this definitely gets a big thumbs up from me. So before I move on to the final part I want to discuss, let's maybe have a few words on Haytham as a character as well. First of all, I think it was quite a brilliant move to start the game not as the main protagonist, but as basically the enemy, as a Templar, and not even telling you about it, fooling you for a few hours before the truth came out. I mean, there were hints about it, but when you started, I think you definitely, went along with the assumption that you were playing an assassin, which you did not. And I think we kind of needed this kind of insight into the Templar Order, especially after the Ezio trilogy, where the Templars were not really all that ambiguous. I mean, we had people like Cesare in those games, who was basically comic book villain level. And it was really hard to believe that someone like Rodrigo Borgia worked for any higher ideal than his own search for power. So I guess it was definitely necessary to, have a closer look at the Templar Order and explain their motivations a little bit more, and maybe even create a little bit of understanding for their ideals, even if only for the purpose of turning them into more believable and interesting opponents. And I feel it kind of worked in case of Haytham. On the other hand, it was really offset by someone like Charles Lee, who turned out to be almost just as comic book villain level as Cesare. And the fact that Haytham supported him until the end didn't really leave me with a whole lot of sympathy when he died. I mean, I honestly don't even fully understand why he defended him so violently, because we've seen him kill Braddock, we've seen him kill Church, so he obviously has no problems going against other Templars for one reason or another. As a matter of fact, didn't he go after Braddock because allegedly he was getting too cruel and killing innocent people? So what was so special about Lee that he felt the need to defend him like that? I honestly didn't see it, but the fact that he did made all the other things that he said feel really hollow. I mean, he said, yes, we are also in favor for independence, but Lee definitely did not work in favor for it, because he started the Boston Massacre. He betrayed the Patriots at the Battle of Monmouth. And in the final battle with Connor, Haytham even said something like, we didn't harm your people. So did the village just spontaneously self-combust or whatever? I mean, we know what Lee has done, and we don't really know why Haytham supported him when he had no problems killing someone like Braddock, unless he killed him for other reasons than he claimed he was. So yeah, I guess they were trying to give us some insights into the Templars. But yeah, if you talk about peace and order, but at the same time you support someone like Lee, I don't really find you all that believable. As a matter of fact, the one Templar that I actually thought was very believable was Hickey. Because Hickey said, I'm working for them because they pay me. And that is something that, well, maybe not something I can respect, but something I can understand. I think he was far more honest than Haytham, who talked about all these ideals, but when push came to shove, he was still supporting Lee despite all he did. So, yeah, it was interesting to play as Haytham, and I thought he is a very interesting character. But there is a lot about him and his decisions that I don't really understand even after playing him for a few hours. So there's that. But maybe in conclusion to the story, I thought overall the story was actually pretty good. It was very cinematic at times, and I never felt bored by it. So I would say this was actually pretty good. And yeah, finally, let's talk about Desmond and the end of the game. Now, Desmond's fate is not utterly clear. I mean, I'm going to assume that he died when he freed Juno, even though it's not specifically stated as such. But assuming that he did, I guess this is the end to his story now. I guess he did get some kind of closure, because at least he made up with his father before he died, so that's a plus. And as somebody who likes the heroic sacrifice trope quite a bit, I'm not really all that mad about the ending. Of course, I'm not entirely sure if Desmond actually knew he was going to die if he touched that globe. If he didn't, it's not exactly a sacrifice, because he wasn't aware he was going to sacrifice himself. But in the end, I'm not really mad about him dying. I always say that if you have no more stories to tell with a character, then you may as well kill him off at the end. There's no reason to keep a fictional character alive just for, I don't know, your personal headcanon or whatever. So I think his death at the end was okay. I guess it could have been handled better, but I'm not really upset about it either. He saved the world, and he died doing it, so, well, that's a good end for a hero, I would say. Did he deserve a better end? Maybe. But to be honest, you could kind of feel that they never really knew what to do with his character. So I guess it was just a case of we have no more interesting stories to tell with his character. So they ended his story here, and I don't know, it's fine with me. It's completely fine with me. And another question maybe is, did he make the right decision in freeing Juno to prevent the solar flare from destroying almost all of the planet? I would say yes, because, like I said in that final episode, at the very least, it's going to buy us some time. It's going to stop the immediate catastrophe that's going to kill, I don't know, millions, maybe billions of people. And it's kind of delaying it to a different kind of danger, but once that problem arises, we can find a way to fight it. In addition to that, I'm also very intrigued by that conflict that apparently exists within the first civilization survivors, if you can call them that. So we had Minerva against Juno, and they apparently had different opinions on how to proceed. And I'm actually pretty sure that at some point during the Ezio trilogy, when I was wondering why these quote-unquote gods were at the one hand helping us and at the other hand really seemed to hate us, I speculated that maybe there are different opinions among these quote-unquote gods, that some of them are maybe a little bit more sympathetic towards humans than others. And the reason why I had that theory is because it would be perfectly in line with a lot of ancient mythologies, where you often had, different kind of gods that had very different opinions about humankind. Some of them were actually quite sympathetic towards them, others were not. One prominent example would be Prometheus, who gave fire to humanity. Or if we go back even further, we have the original Babylonian flood myth, where the gods, most of them, try to destroy humanity in a giant flood. The reason why the gods wanted to destroy humans is actually kind of funny. They wanted to destroy them all because they were too loud. The big cities were just too noisy, and the gods felt disturbed by the cities, so they just wanted to drown the entire humanity. And there was one god who was like, I don't really want to do that, I kind of like them. So he went to one particular human, Utnapishtim is his name in the Babylonian version, I think, and he told him, build an ark, put your family and animals on it, and then you will survive the flood. And I would even argue that the whole flood myth works a lot better in a polytheistic context, where you have some gods that are vengeful and cruel, and, at least one god who is sympathetic and merciful, whereas in the biblical monotheistic context, you suddenly only have one god, and he is both vengeful and merciful at the same time. So you can see that this story originally came from a polytheistic background. So it would make kind of sense to me that maybe these first civilization people have different opinions about humanity too. And I am very curious to see how this story continues in the upcoming games. But yeah, I think that's pretty much all I wanted to talk about. Overall, I think it was a good game. Maybe I didn't enjoy it quite as much as the Ezio games, but it did bring a few new aspects both in gameplay and in, story to the table. So I think it was still worthwhile to play this. And now I'm looking forward to be a pirate in Black Flag. But before we're going to play Black Flag, there will be one other game in between, which is going to be Tales from the Borderland. As usual, I will take one day off in between games. So the first episode of Tales from the Borderland is going to start next Monday. And once I'm done with that, we will return to Assassin's Creed and play Black Flag. So yeah, overall, I hoped you enjoyed my playthrough. I hope you liked the way that I edited it, because I edited a lot more stuff than usual. I cut out most of the minor missions and side missions. So I hope I found a good balance here, where I have most of the important stuff in the Let's Play while not getting too repetitive with other smaller missions. And I will probably continue this in some form in the next game as well. Edit out some stuff that just feels like a repeat of stuff we've seen before a lot of times, while keeping everything that is new and original and interesting and important. But yeah, let's end the video here. I hope you will come back for my next Let's Play. And until then, I say goodbye and see you again next time.